be disciplined, moderate, focused, and on message. And with that, we're going to turn to the financial review. We'll hear from Sarah and John, and probably a little bit from James. So we'll have three-part harmony on this part. And following that, we will have questions. And once we've had questions, we'll then move to some commentary, and then we'll move to resolution. So we can be quick. Okay, James, over to you. You do the introductions, and let's move.
Thank you, Chair. So the financial elements of the review were predominantly undertaken by John and Sarah, neither of whom have had any prior association with the RWSS. However, having said that, they were reliant on information provided by Waterview Capital Advisors, who are the financial advisors to HBRC, and they did rely upon information from Lewis Tucker Limited in relation to uptake. But between themselves and my review team, we've done our very best to scrutinise all of that information provided to ensure that we have some confidence in its validity. So with that, I'll hand over to John and Sarah.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Chair. I guess I should just start by saying that this I've been given a very strict time allowance, so that this presentation today is very much a high-end review of key conclusions and key risks in the report. There's much more detail in the report, as you all know. But perhaps I could just start by saying that the financial review really considers all of the components of the business case. So that is, considers the capital expenditure, funding levels, operational costs, revenue, and looks at the returns available under various uptake scenarios, which I'll deal with shortly. So we just need to set the scene really, because the business case really is still as at July 2016, the last time in which you received reports or reviews on the business case. And at that time, and still remains today, the level of sales or forward levels of sales level to foundation water users is 42.8 million cubes. Contract price has been negotiated, a price that is fixed both as to time and price. The cost of the dam in those negotiations is at $282 million plus a further provision of $10 million should the network be extended. So that's for the 282 is for the dam and associated infrastructure. And the estimated capital spend at construction end, which includes all of those construction costs, plus operational costs, some allowance for further land acquisitions, development costs, bank interest and fees, is expected to be $340 million. So just to comment further, noting that 42.8 million forward sales level is ahead of the CP original condition precedent of 40 million cubes, still behind the bank condition precedent of 45 million cubes. So just moving on, Sarah, to how that is funded, and you're all familiar with this, but equity from HBRC of $80 million, institutional investor equity of 80 million, totalling 160 equity, debt from the bank of around 85, further debt from Crown Irrigation Investments of 95 million, totalling 180 million debt. So total spend is 340 million. I haven't detailed, but you'll be aware that it's intended that partway through the construction period, a further capital raising will take place, known as the Tuki-Tuk note. It's a convertible note of 35 million intended to pay the first tranche of Crown Irrigation, so that would replace that, and in time that amount of $35 million convertible note will convert to a 16% shareholding, and that's much later on in the scheme. So Just turning now to a major component, obviously, of the business case, revenue. Revenue, obviously, is simply a function of water price times demand. And the demand model has already been referred to in earlier discussions today on the development of that demand model. A very close focus on farm affordability of water over various land use types which are anticipated to be in the Ruataniwha catchment area, and extensive modelling around that was taken place. And I guess it's as well as extensive modelling, it really has been extensively reviewed. And it should be noted also that it's withstood a review on behalf of the institutional investors and funders. That those reviews undertaken by Lewis Tucker were on behalf of the institutional investor and Crown Irrigation Limited. So overall, although slightly different conclusions were reached on the way the models would work and indeed the way the models themselves were applied, there was consistent general agreement on the demand model outputs. So we've been obliged to rely on that, and I think that the degree of validation that has taken place over some years and the degree of independent valuation for other investors and funders is of some provides a fair level of comfort. However, the financial model considers three cases: base case, where it's anticipated that 100% uptake is achieved in the 11th year of operation; a further case known as a downside case, whereby 7 years later the 100% uptake is achieved, year 18 of operation; and again a severe downside case which assumes that 82% is achieved by year 6, but then no further water is sold, known as the severe downside case. Lewis Tucker assumes a slightly later uptake in the earlier years, but achieves a full uptake some years earlier than the base case. But overall, the revenue impact is very similar in the Lewis Tucker case and the financial base case. So I think that my view is that that the way in which the business case has assessed demand under those various demand levels is appropriate and conservative. So what is notable is that under all scenarios, operational costs, debt obligations, and return to equity investors is provided. Expenditure is very straightforward. Capital costs to dam and distribution network substantially fixed price, as I've said, but it has lapsed, and I'll comment on that later. There is a need to reconsider that price, of course, if you make the decision to go ahead. And operational and maintenance costs, we consider those have been properly researched and inflation adjusted, and we're quite satisfied with the way in which those costs have been assessed in the model. So just turning now to the return on investment. There's a fair bit of detail again on this on the report, but I've extracted the key points so that we've assumed, I should say that in James's summary paper, he has looked at the cash yield rather than the project life internal rate of return. And the reason he's done that is that his commentary is around the 6% required return by councillors, and therefore it's a strict comparison with the cash yield that the return brings, that the scheme brings. We consider that the proper way to look at this as an investment approach is by considering the internal rate of return. That adjusts for the time value of money, and that's why this return, of course, is lower than the cash yield return shown in the report and commented on in James's summary. So we're showing there a return, an IRR of 7.1%, that's post-tax, 6.2% downside and 5.8% in severe downside. We note also this is from work completed by Butcher on his one of his economic reports, and by Waterside Capital, that the additional throughput through the port as a consequence of the dam proceeding would allow another 130 basis points to be added to the return of 1.3%, so that the base case return, for example, would then increase to 8.4%. So moving on to the 6% cash return required by the Regional Council. So this is a stipulation that you have in place whereby from day one funds advanced to the scheme must return a 6% cash return to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. It has some problems, of course, because the forecast distribution to HBRC and on to the Regional Council is not achieved, does not equate to the 6% return, which if you do the maths, 6% on 80 million is 4.8 million a year. It gets close around about 20 years out and doesn't fully equate until year 22. So that requires some borrowing. Before I comment on that, just to say that the base case internal rate of return naturally increases as a result of the enhanced return of 6% coming in the early years to the council all the way through. So that increases to 10.5. That includes the impact of the Port of Napier uplift. So the HBRC will then be obliged to fund that shortfall. It may well be that it looks to increasing having a period of special dividends from the Port of Napier. In our model, we've provided for 3 years at around about 3.4 million a year for that to occur. If that's not feasible, then additional borrowing will need to take place, so that over time the borrowing will peak at around about year 30 in the scheme, and the range of borrowing that could occur depends on whether it's an adverse or severe, downside case, which would be the $80 million, or the base case, which would be $60 million. Probably more likely to be more towards 60 million than 80 million, I'd suggest. So, in fact, that level of borrowing, given the value of HBRC at that time, remembering that HBRC has 100% ownership of the port as well as an investment in the dam, the percentage of borrowing to value is still reasonably low, around about 4 to 5% if it's the base case result, and up to 13% if we're dealing with the severe downside case, which I remind you is where uptake stops at 82% and there's no more sales. I thought it worthwhile mentioning also at this time that so far as the Port of Napier is concerned, its separate legal and capital structure means that if there was an adverse financial outcome from the Ruataniwha Dam, the port would be immune from that impact. And that's very important to ensure that protection is in place. It achieves that by being a separate entity, by not being in any way a guarantor to any borrowing, and retains its own separate financial and legal integrity. So I just wanted to comment finally on what we see as the key risks. But despite what I've said around the demand model, which is clearly a very rigorous and heavily validated piece of work, the demand still remains a key risk. You're sitting currently around about 43 million cubes, and we have a long way to go. There appears to be a lot of persuasive argument around the work done by Lewis Tucker and others, and earlier studies, as I've mentioned before, around the uptake. And I suppose just from an observation would be that it'll be interesting to see what level of uptake and what acceleration there is in levels of uptake once and if the scheme is approved to go ahead. One would think that many farmers are still holding off until knowing that that's going to occur. Clearly, a potential increase in the design instruction and contract price is a key issue, and directors will have to manage that in the best way they can, and that obviously could impact on the success or otherwise of the business case, given the degree of inflation around in the construction sector at the moment. I also mentioned that the dam consortium has to be fit for purpose. I mean that financially fit for purpose. There has to be the balance sheet integrity in place to ensure that the directors are satisfied that the consortium is able to handle the significant commercial risk in building the dam. Obviously, that's something that the bank will need to be satisfied about as well. One of the mitigations, though, is a suggestion or recommendation from HBRC that came essentially after we had completed this report, and that was to establish a condition precedent of 50 million cubes. That is a material increase on where you were before, a 25% increase over the 40 million cube original condition precedent, and a 20% increase over the 45 million cube bank condition precedent. So it's material, and it will provide, I think, a strong indication of demand and hopefully enable some greater certainty around demand in the scheme. It will also generate around or at least 1.5 million per annum free cash as a consequence of starting at that level rather than a much lower level as forecast in the demand, in the business case. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I wanted to say at the moment. It's a relatively brief presentation, but obviously happy to answer questions.
No, that's all. I'm here to answer questions.
Okay. All right. Councillors, questions. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question in regard to the borrowing to provide the rate of return, which I think and you've done that in best endeavour, obviously. But I just have a concern that, well, not a concern, but just something I'd like to test out with you or tease out with you. Rate of return versus annual rate of return is the key issue for me here. So if we want to take the 6% each year, we're going to have to borrow that money. Now, I put to you that in the 28 years that this organisation's been as it is, through a range of technologies, different focus from the public, different councils, different chief executives, etc. We're a different unit today than we were 28 years ago. And our expectation on expenditure, our use of disruptive technology such as drones, etc. We're slowly getting better at what we do with less. If you get where I'm going with this, would it be fair to, and don't assume anything here because you haven't done the work, but that's based on today, isn't it? Yeah. So there's no guarantees that we're going to actually draw down that amount and borrow that amount in the next 30 years.
I think that's a.
Well, I can.
I think that's a pitch to be here at 7 o'clock tonight. But anyway, respond if you wish to, please.
I'll endeavour to be very brief, Mr. Chair. I think that one of the issues is that the scheme itself is required to repay all of its bank debt by the end of the 35-year consent period. Now that's properly expressed in the model, but in reality it's unlikely that that would be the case because typically in schemes like this the consent extension, if you like, is obtained before the end of the consent period and before the bank term actually runs out. So that's a long-winded way of saying there would be additional money in the scheme quite significant to fund the shareholders, and therefore mitigate some of that debt that HBRC would be having to raise. It's one way of answering it. Yes, it's difficult to foresee what the future brings indeed, but that's just one observation I could make which might be helpful, Mr Chair.
Councillor Balfour.
I've been warned. I can't get any closer, Mr. Chairman, but I'd like to compliment you for putting this chart on page 8 of your report, which we first saw a version of from Deloitte's a long time ago. And I have a question about it, and for those who in the audience who haven't seen the full report here, I urge you to look at this chart because it's a very straightforward statement of what level of water sales will in fact support what obligations the project has. And it's sort of a ladder scale here. And you've spoken favorably toward the 50 million mark as providing some additional risk mitigation. But as I look at the chart and what gets covered at various levels, I'm curious as to why you wouldn't have picked the 57 to 62 or even the 65 level, because obviously what the public has heard is that we're break even at 42 or whatever it historically was.
Sure.
Now we're up to 50, but the fact of the matter is 50 doesn't cover all the obligations that this project has. So why 50? Why not 60?
Well, good question. Why not? And that's the difficulty, of course, because it's just a judgment call. I'm reminding you also that this is an HBRC suggestion, not my own suggestion. In fact, my own recommendation was 48. And I made that suggestion because I think it seemed to me impractical to have a target too far into the future, which is going to compromise the ultimate contract price. It really is it's a trade-off, and I understand where you're coming from. I think that where you are going is possibly perfect world in terms of getting a return, a decent return to equity holders and covering everything and essentially eliminating a great deal of risk. So I think it's a matter for councillors to decide at what point do you have to put a line in the sand and say, we originally set our CP at 40%. It is 40%, 40 million cubes. Going up to 50 is significant, in my view, and that ought to give you a very good indication. I hear what you're saying, but I think to go beyond that stretches the time period out too far for my comfort in terms of your exposure to increasing costs on the price of the dam.
Councillor Bevan, did you have a question? Councillor Balfour?
Well, just on the risk chart that you have behind you there, you did mention you mentioned cost, potential cost escalation. I guess the construction cost of the dam still awaits ultimately the review of an independent panel that actually has to confirm that it meets all their expectations in terms of whatever, seismic or what have you. You mentioned at some point a cost change becomes material to the projections you've made. What number is that? Is it 50 million? Is it 100 million? Is it 10 million? At what point does a cost escalation become serious?
It's funny, I thought you'd ask me that. I find it difficult to answer, to be honest. I think that I'm also concerned about perhaps expressing a view on that, and that may influence negotiations, which the CEO over there is looking very nervous about, of HBRC. I think that the only other comment I would make on that is that there's a bit of a rule of thumb which says that water price can increase by 1 cent and construction price could increase by 10 million. If you do your maths That means that you get $1 million more revenue, which represents about 10% of the 10% return on the 10 million costs that you would have to fund. So that I think there's some. The difficulty is how far can you raise the water price without impacting on demand? I don't know the answer to that. So I'm not going to speculate. I think it's too hard. At the moment, I think that's something that you'll have to consider in due course.
Might be Economics 101, elasticity of demand. Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I note on page 18, under the institutional investor, you've got a fixed annual investor fee for 15 years. Can you tell us what that fixed annual investor fee is, please?
It's 5%.
Councillor Curtin.
Mr. Chair, are we in a position to move the report at this stage, do you think? If so, I'd like to move.
I'm happy to take your motion, but not just yet. I just want to go through and see if all the questions have been asked and give everybody a fair bat. I'm not sure that everybody's asked all the questions yet. Okay, no more questions on the financials? Thank you very much for your presentation and your advice. Very precise. I like it.
Chair, with your indulgence, I'd like to make a couple of concluding remarks.
Indulgence? I think, how about permission? I'll give you that.
Thank you, Chair. At the very front end of the executive summary in the report, I've noted that the Ruataniwha Water Storage Scheme is a particularly bold and transformational project. As such, given its scale, given the nature of it being a commercial undertaking, operating in a market context, there are inherently and inevitably a wide range of risks and a wide range of and some uncertainties. If there weren't risks and uncertainties, the scheme would be neither bold nor transformational. It would be more akin with the sorts of things that the council is more commonly, I guess, adept at undertaking, such as building a stock bank or something like that, which is easily quantifiable, fundable from the outset, and doesn't have much uncertainty. When the council gets involved in economic development, it's operating in a commercial space. And so the questions which have just been levelled and the discussion we've just had around the uncertainty around uptake and what that therefore means for the rate of return is quite similar in nature to the issues around nitrogen management and the environment, in so much as we know what the framework looks like, we know what the range of possibilities look like, but we're left with some uncertainty. And I guess, therefore, the concluding sentiment that I would like to leave councillors and the community with is that there are inherent risks and uncertainties which cannot be completely avoided with undertaking a project of this nature. And unfortunately and uncomfortably for councillors, there is a point in time at which a decision is required in relation to this scheme where there will remain some degree of uncertainty. And where that point of comfort lies is very much over to councillors to determine. But we are unable, I think, in practical terms, to get to a point where we have totally removed the financial risks and uncertainties as well as the environmental ones. That's just the nature of the project, and at some point in time the council will need to draw a line and say we are satisfied that the risks and uncertainties are acceptable, or we have concluded that it's not worthy of continuing our investment in this project given that those risks and uncertainties are too large for our comfort. So that resides with you, and ultimately I guess that is the overarching conclusion of this review. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think we now move to debate. I think it's appropriate to take a resolution at this stage, and Councillor Curtin has moved.
Yes, happy to move, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Wilson. the recommendation that the report be received? All right. Speaking to the motion.
Yes,
Councillor
thank
Stewart.
you, Mr Chair, and as one of the proponents of the review in the first instance, I'm very pleased to speak to the receipt of the review at this point, and I would start by probably making about 3 points. The first is to congratulate and thank James and his team for a superb job in very trying conditions. If you recall, setting out on this journey about 5 months ago, and net 4 months of work with the intervening of the Christmas period, etc. So what we've had is a tremendous amount of information consolidated, pulled together by an independent group of people, carefully marshalled and by James and his team, akin to herding cats, I would imagine. But eventually we've come out with a very comprehensive review which points in very specific directions. I would comment that the review itself was very important from a public perspective. I know that some councillors and others may have felt that this was a futile exercise when already the consultation and dialogue with the community had been had. I disagree with that position, and I think the outcomes of the review demonstrate that there were a great number of issues that have been put under the microscope and are now in one comprehensive document for people to see. It's not to say that clarity has been obtained right across all of those issues, but I think in considering the 5 topics, we can come to some reasonable conclusion on balance. The first, economics. On balance, we can say that the scheme receives a tick. I think financially, in my view, we can say, subject to the recommendations that have just been outlined in terms of sale of water, we can say that the scheme is entitled to proceed on that basis. I say that when we look at the engineering issues, we can say, on balance, with risk, we can proceed with the project. We are left, though, with a substantial issue, and that is around the environmental impacts. I believe that the review has brought right to forefront the issues that are ultimately the most at stake with this project, and fortunately there's still time to look at those and obtain further comfort around them. James has brought to us somewhat of a poisoned chalice. He's brought the issues down to whether we proceed and harm the environment with added burden of nitrogen loss, with uncertainty about achieving a limit which has been imposed on us. He's prescribed various ways of circumventing or modifying or coming to a different position on those, but the reality is we've got that framework with the DIN 0.8 in front of us, and we need to know with more certainty how we manage that. I believe James has put us in a position of damned if we do and damned if we don't, if you excuse the expression. He said in his report, taken together, the environmental issues canvassed by the review present a difficult choice for council because there are risks and uncertainties to proceed or not. And that essentially gets the council in a position of making a value and judgment call about those risks and that uncertainty. For me, and I'm, in summary, Mr Chair, confident that we can go to the public with an independent review which essentially gets across the line in all but one area, but we have some small amount of work to do. No, I should modify that. A significant amount of work to do to satisfy that mitigation energy that we need, and picking up on Councillor Bevan's point, not only for the council, because we will wear the cost of that environmental impact if we do not achieve the environmental outcomes, but also for those investors going into it, including the farming community, who must wear also that cost. They need to know that with some certainty. But on balance, if we address that issue to a satisfaction of council, I believe that we can proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to reserve my right, but considering I still have to catch a horse in the holding paddock and get back up north, I'll expedite the process for you, Chair. Very happy to receive and note this report. Possibly was one that Councillor Curtin was referring to as a review sceptic before this started. But I actually think the process has validated the last 5 years of work. And on that basis, it's been a very worthwhile exercise for this council to run. There are new people around the table that have had pieces of the conversation, but not the whole thing. It's been laid out bare, transparently, independently, and in my view, it validates the work that's been done to date. Does it remove all the risk? Absolutely not. Does it expose a fatal flaw in anything? Absolutely not, including the environment, I might add. Sure, there's challenges there, but the challenges that exist today are not going away. And with or without the dam, you've got a couple of choices to make, certainly around the environment. With the dam, you have some levers that we will not ever get a chance to pull without it, certainly around the financial, if you like, imposition on members who are laggards and are not towing the line, a level of scrutiny on environmental outcomes that we haven't seen before, and a joint, if you like, ambition to make it a better place. So I think the answers that have come out of this have been quite clear and have validated a lot of work done by a lot of people over many, many hours. I'd also like to add, just quickly, Chair, that Mr. Palmer and his team, an incredible amount of work in a short amount of time. I suspect the golf clubs are starting to rust in the shed, James, on that basis. So thank you very much for the work you've done. Not so much a review sceptic anymore, Chair, as someone who's saying, yep, there's enough information on the table for 9 councillors to make an informed decision on the 31st of May. Thank you.
Councillor Bevan.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few comments from me. Firstly, James, I suppose everybody around the table is going to thank you for the hard work you've done and the midnight hours that you've burnt, and not just you, but the rest of the team internally. And I know you've worked really hard to get something that's both independent and balanced, and I thank you for that. There was some criticism about the fact that we were taking a cup of tea during this time. In fact, if we were going to take a cup of tea, this was the perfect time to do it, because we can't actually take this project forward, even if we had decided to do so today. We can't take it forward until such time as the court case on the land swap is resolved. So if we're going to pause and have a look, this is the perfect time to do it. And the review has done an excellent job in crystallising the key issues, probably in all of our minds, and they'll probably be different for different people, but for me, there's the financial returns in the early year to HBRC, which I think needs some review, and I think if we set a CP of 50 instead of 40, I think we de-risk some of the investment, and I think that might give us some grounds for negotiation, so that's something that I'm sure we'll be talking to HBRC about. The other one, as Councillor Curtin's pointed out, is the issues around the environment and the uncertainty that we face, that we as councillors need to feel more comfortable than I do, even having looked through this review 2 or 3 times, around how we mitigate those risks. And I think it's really important that when we meet again on the 24th, we either get some comfort around that, or we set a condition precedent that gives you time to give us comfort, because I can't support this until I can see a way forward in regard to the management of the environment, which for me is a priority that we've got to ensure is looked after through this whole process. The other comment I'd like to make, Chair, is just around the whole business of uncertainty for farmers who have basically put lots of plans on hold for quite some time now, and we've gone through, I think it's something like 10 revisions of the date for financial close, and there might be 1 or 2 more yet. So that creates a lot of uncertainty, both in terms of the investment for us, but also we have to think about the farmers who have signed up and had to put things on hold until such time as we get a resolution one way or the other. And I think it's really important and behoven upon us to try and bring some certainty for them by the end of this month.
I think Peter's comment that this review has helped crystallize some issues is right on point. It's sharpened some matters that have been contentious, but I'm afraid to say the review leaves them still twisting in the wind from my standpoint, and I speak specifically of the environmental aspects of this. We're entering into this in the first instance, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just reflecting my values, with a mind toward improving the ecological health of the Tukituki catchment. We're not entering into this in the first instance to improve the economic well-being of what I see as a rather small part of our economy. 5% of the land under cultivation for orcharding, pastoral care farming, viticulture, you name it. The catchment served by this project is 5% of Hawke's Bay. And if we're going to spend this kind of money to do something, quote, transformational in support of improving, or as we hope we are doing, improving the CHB economy, then we can only do that if we're convinced that transformation also doesn't mean irreparable damage to the environment in that catchment, which we might find impossible to repair once we've started down the course. If I were to mark through every sentence in the environmental discussion in this summary that had the words, "we don't know, time will tell, maybe, perhaps," et cetera, this document would look like a CIA redacted document. And so for anyone to walk away from reading this, and certainly if you've had the benefit of reading the backup paper as well, to say that this would be a satisfying or a document that satisfies environmental angst about this project, I don't know where you're finding it. I just don't know where you're finding it. There are a whole variety of things we don't know. We don't have detailed land use we're talking about a huge investment here, and we don't even have a detailed land use map of what's going on in the catchment. A number of us have tried to find out how much water is actually being used in the catchment under these consents, and we've been told it's too hard to figure out. We don't know the actual amount of water being used. We've been told flushing flows are going to come to the rescue. Well, yes, if you happen to live, in the top 1/3 of the catchment, maybe, only a maybe. And by contrast, I guess I would say, I think I am the only councillor who has sat on the stakeholder group for this project and the stakeholder group for the tank process. And if I were to give a numerical score to the level of effort and the amount of depth that we know in these two cases, I might give tank a 9 and by comparison, this a 2. And on top of that, we have a substantial legal uncertainty as to what the goalposts are, whether they're movable or not, and so forth, which I think we absolutely have to resolve early, not later. So I'm happy to receive the report because I do think it advances everybody's understanding, or can if they take the time to read it, of what all's at issue here. And I acknowledge the amount of work that's gone into it. But I'd have to say that to me, it raises a different possible outcome, which is not a binary one. It's not yes or no. It may be yes, no, or after. I just think there's too much uncertainty on the environmental side of this to make a commitment of this nature at this point in time. And I'm hopeful that as we go through the next few weeks, we will come up with some other approach, maybe including further condition precedent that is aimed at trying to get a better grip on what the what the environmental prospects of this project actually entail, given the infirmities of the regime that we look to be implementing. So thank you for this piece of work, and good luck.
Councillor Dick.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in my view, the review, which is an excellent piece of work, has validated the proposal, the RWSS proposal, in all respects, and even in terms of the environmental issue, where there is some work to do regardless in sorting out some errors made in the Board of Inquiry many years ago. In my view, in regard to the environment, the glass is half full, not half empty, and more water in the river and water security for farmers to enable them to change their farm management regimes gives me confidence that we will achieve the objectives gradually over time.
Yes. 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 Yes, I think the review was excellent. I don't want to compare it to Tank because I haven't been involved, but I'll certainly give it a 10 out of 10, so that gets a better average with the 2. I've been farming in Central Hawke's Bay for 54 years, and I know what it feels like to have a drought. And while we can say on the hill country, quite rightly, some of the people in the paper have said, well, it's not going to help you. Well, it certainly is when you've got store lambs and nowhere to take them. And if you've got 20-odd thousand hectares of irrigated land down there on the flats, it certainly makes a difference to how people in the hill country farm. As far as the environmental things, we have concerns. I'm speaking now on behalf of Tamatea Māori. Huge concerns, but I also have a huge faith in Central Hawke's Bay farmers, and we'll get through this.
Just before I call councillor, we're going to say, councillors, if you want to speak, say so, or else we'll move on to the resolution. Yes. No, it shouldn't be shrinking violets at this table. Councillor Bailey.
Thank you for those sage words of advice, Chair. When this review was first announced, I said that it needed to be 3 things for me. It needed to be independent, have sufficient scope, and easy for the public to digest. I'm certainly comfortable that the review was completed independently and without interference, and thanks for that, James. As for the scope, that was decided some time ago. There's been other questions come out of there. But as for being easy for the public to digest, that's not your fault. That's because these are complex issues which, as has been said, it can go either way. And and for that reason, it's never going to come out and be an easy read. You have to sit down and really go through it. But that's fine. in terms of where I'm going to go in the future, I'll leave that for another day. So thank you.
Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you, Chair. James, I too would like to acknowledge the huge amount of work and time and effort that you personally and your team have put into this report. And goodness me, if we've been through it 3 times, I know that you've been through it so many more. And anyone who can spend Easter reading 26,000 pages of the Board of Inquiry report really needs a medal. So thank you, James. In terms of satisfying the people around the table, who are the current decision makers, I certainly hope that these reports have gone a long way towards doing that. Ruataniwha is more than about just delivering water. It's about environmental outcomes, social outcomes, cultural outcomes and economic outcomes. And in terms of the ecological aspects of what we're trying to achieve within the catchment and the environmental things we're trying to achieve, I'd just make the comment that without Ruataniwha, the cost of what we are trying to achieve is just not going to happen. It will be absolutely impossible. We are so lucky that we've got a scheme that is going to be able to deliver a increased minimum flows. Where else are they going to come from? If you don't store water in times of excess, then I just don't know what the solution will be. There are a couple of areas that this report hasn't looked at, and I'm going to raise them just briefly. I'm not going to take you to 7 o'clock, Chair, but so this report's focused on a lot of negatives that have been coming up from the community. So I'll just take you back to some of the positives, and they weren't traversed here because they were generally agreed, and there are huge positives that will come out of this project. So recreationally, we're going to have enhanced environmental flows that will aid anglers, for instance, and swimmers and kayakers, and that's just not up on the dam site, or even water skiers if you might not get blown over, but all throughout the catchment there's huge recreational opportunities that aren't yet seen. You've touched on the social side of things, and Mike's touched on the cultural, so I needn't go there again, but just to say there comes a point in time when we need to make a decision as councillors. We've been charged to get on and make that decision, and we need to be bold about doing so. So thank you once again, and I look forward to the discussions wrapping up over the next couple of meetings.
Thank you. Just before I call Councillor Curtin to close it, I'd like to, from the Chair, say thank you to you, James. Reading the work, reading the report and others, I think it's up there with the 7 challenges of Hercules, a monster effort to take an incredibly wide, disparate pile of information and reduce it to be readable and credible. For me, the reports have likened on a microscope, where sometimes things are a bit fuzzy, change the point of focus, and things become sharper and clearer. I think that's what your report has done. It's sharpened and clarified things, the issues for us, and I think that's hugely beneficial. The other thing that the report has done is moved some issues forward. Let's not underrate the fact that we've got now HBRC saying, which they hadn't said before, well, we think 50 million cubic metres is what it needs. This is a significant shift forward in a way. So other things have moved here. I don't think we should underestimate how much movement there's been here. But in doing so, I think the issue for me now, just sensing around the room, is to be assured about the environmental issues. And you have highlighted in your report a number of weaknesses in some areas where we can make to attend. And the challenge for this council is to go through those. And I accept without hesitation your point that there will always be inherent risks and inherent uncertainties. And we'll never have all of the information necessary to be absolutely certain. We'll never have something which is absolutely risk-free. So there's going to be this measure and balance of are we comfortable with the uncertainties, are we comfortable with the risks? And in terms of that gentle balancing act that it was going to do in the head, I think this report has added immensely to that. Timely and a great report, and I don't think it'll ever get to the number 1 on the bestseller at the local bookshop, but it certainly is, if you want to read a report on how to clarify things, a really good example of that. Well done to you and the team. Neil, to
Thank
close.
you, Mr. Chair, and just briefly summing up, in my view, the report has ended where it always should have, on the environment. It's about the environment. Sure, there are issues that on the way the report has clarified, but we can now, in my view, put those aside and focus on the core issue. In over 200 years or more of human occupation, the use of this land has been about the economy and our human recreation and utility of it. We must now move to a new phase across this region where economy and our pleasure and our well-being are not trumped, if you like, or do not trump the environment. And my view, this next phase is about ensuring that for this scheme to proceed, we are satisfied, and picking up on a comment from both Councillor Belford and Councillor Bevan, this report tells us that there are environmental issues that are not currently satisfied, and over the next period of time, at least until the Supreme Court makes its decision, we've got that opportunity to ensure we are satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, councillors, the question is that the report be received. Those in favour will say aye. Aye. Contrary will say no. Declare it carried. That comes to the formal part of our meeting. We now have a public excluded part, and I'd like to take on Councillor Fenton Wilson's motion. You're moving? Seconded by Councillor Curtin. All those who are in favour of that motion will say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Carried.